event of Rapture This Car will be unattended.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's pray, and then we'll get started for our last week here. God, we thank you for the chances we had to be together on Wednesdays to look at the poets, prophets, priests, and kings, the people in your Old Testament that have helped us to learn the story as a whole. We ask today, as we wrap this up, that we might be reminded how this story holds together and how each of these characters play a part in us learning how to be more like you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right. So we're going to talk about poetry today, the poetry of the Bible. Let me make sure my clicker is connected. There we go. The poets. We're going to talk about the poets. This is the last episode, and so we're going to talk about that. Poetry makes up a large part of the Bible. We're going to talk about what that is and all those kind of things. There are books of the Bible that are called the poetic books, and we're going to look at each of those individually in more detail later, but it's Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Lamentations. Those are the six books that are considered to be mostly poetry. Most times they do a book of five, and Lamentations does not always make the cut in that, but from a lot of scholars, but I think it's a little bit of that too. So we'll look at those books a little bit. The poetry makes up a large part of the Bible. In fact, just off those books, that's 1/3 of the Old Testament. So 1/3 of the Old Testament are the poetic books. In addition to the poetic books themselves, there are large sections of poetry in other biblical books, well over half of Isaiah, over 1/3 of Jeremiah, around a fifth of Ezekiel, to get real technical, and as well as more than half of the materials in the minor prophets, Hosea and Malachi, that we looked at last week, and other poetic sections in other places, like there's Hannah has a psalm in 1 Samuel 2 that is poetic. So the Old Testament contains a large amount of poetry, and some people actually say that 1/2 of the Old Testament is really poetic. And since the Old Testament makes up more than 2/3 of our Bibles, there are even some poetic sections of the New Testament as well. And if we do the math and we add it all up, poetry by its sheer numbers alone is a real important part of how we look at the Bible. And it does a lot of things. The poetry in the Bible is really about a chance to express kind of things using figurative language, imaginary language, and really expressive kind of stuff. And it really gets into some important things. It expresses a range of emotions and experiences, including things like suffering and sin and forgiveness, joy, worship, and love. So all those kind of things are expressed in all these emotions and different things. What they do is they try to take the experience of the people of God, or a subsection of the people of God that are suffering, and they talk about it in ways that allow us to experience more about who God might be. We think about the story of Job. I mean, Job is a story of a man who's suffering, and the language and the imagery that's used in there, the poetic kind of stuff, and it doesn't really. The thing about these books is that a lot of these books don't sound poetic to us because the translation doesn't work. But also, poetic is not just all rhyming and iambic pentameter and all this kind of cadence kind of stuff. I mean, poetry is a larger kind of genre of the English language. I remember when I was in middle school, I was 8th grade English. I had a former nun who was my English teacher. I actually turned out to be a friend of my sister's when my sister started teaching too. But she taught us this book called Song of Roland, which was this epic poetry kind of thing. And it was this novel we read, and it was all about knights and battles and sword fights and all this kind of stuff. And so what she did was she looked at our classroom and realized that it was a largely 8th grade boys, and thought, I can get these guys to write poetry if I give them the Song of Roland, and she did. And I actually on my Kindle reader and my iPad here, I could pull up the Song of Roland. Now I just kind of keep it there, and every once in a while I go, oh, I remember this, and it's just kind of there. I just kind of keep it for nostalgic reasons. But it kind of gets at all of these things, and it's not just rhyming in pretty language and stuff like that. It's really kind of more about the creative way in which we talk about these things. So it talks about different stuff, like these ideas here in that. It's often set to music, like the Psalms, but not always. There are other poets in the Old Testament. The King Solomon, who wrote Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes is also known for Proverbs. He's one of the poets. He wrote all those things. When you think about those three books, if King Solomon wrote those three books, what was supposed to be the wisest person, right? So he writes this kind of there's a kind of a growth edge to Solomon writing these songs. So he writes Song of Songs, and if you read Song of Songs, Song of Solomon, there's it doesn't mention a lot about God at all. It's more about a young man falling in love with a beautiful woman and their marriage night and all this kind of stuff. And it's a little bit, depending on the translation you read, it's a little bit colorful, and some people are kind of embarrassed to read it. It's kind of the romance novel section of
Have you ever preached a sermon on it?
I have.
Have you ever talked to a youth group with it?
Yeah. I have.
They love that.
There was one time when I had to read a section.
Yeah.
The Book of Worship suggests a reading from Song of Solomon for as one of the options for a wedding, and I was reading it, and there's a section there you skip, and I usually make a pencil mark in my Bible at this line, and then we pick back up. And the verses you skip, there's a reason you skip them, and I almost didn't. And so you're reading Song of Solomon, I don't remember what comes before it, but the first verse you skipped is, we have a little sister and she has no breasts. And I said, we have a little sister and we're not supposed to read that verse. So I caught myself before I went too far, but that's right. So, but there's this young man kind of does this stuff, and then there's Proverbs, which is kind of where he gets in his wisdom kind of stage, and he really wants to talk about kind of things like that. And then there's Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is kind of like there's nothing new under the sun. He's an old bitter man, and he's the grumpy old man kind of version of Solomon, and he writes these books. And so these books are kind of almost his journals through kind of his life. It's a very interesting kind of a study of who Solomon was. But he's one. David, who wrote most of the Psalms. David did not write all of the Psalms. We'll talk about that a little bit more later when we talk about the Psalms. But David wrote most of the Psalms. Most of the time, traditionally, we think of David writing all Psalms, but he did not. Job is this debate with God and his friends, and this kind of grand rhetoric. The imagery is there. It's at the end when he wants to argue. His friends say, well, you've obviously done something wrong. And he says, no, I didn't. And at the end, he kind of wants to argue with God. And God says, where were you when the world was put together? My image is always, he always kind of looks at Job and says, hey, I tell you what, I'll listen to your argument if you can make a platypus. If you can do something like that, then I'll listen to what you have to say. But other than that, you're not God, so you don't understand all this stuff. It's kind of the message of Job. Isaiah is a lot of Isaiah. Remember, we talked about the prophets. There were probably 3 different books that got combined into Isaiah for different prophets there. But part of that is very poetic. Jeremiah has about a third of the book of Jeremiah is poetic. Ezekiel, and then Hosea to Malachi, these minor prophets that we looked at last week. And then, of course, Hannah, who is credited with one chapter in the Bible of a song that she kind of wrote, so a psalm. So that the historical books tell the story of the nation of Israel. When we get to the end and we look at kind of the grand scope of the Old Testament today, we'll kind of look at that. But the poetic books do a little something different. The poetic books are also known as the wisdom books. They're known as the books of wisdom. And so there's again, figurative language kind of to teach a lesson. Think about Jesus doing parables to teach a lesson. In the Old Testament, the prophets and other leaders would do kind of poetic language to kind of teach some lessons as well. So they're called wisdom books. They focus on not on God's people as a whole, but they focus a lot on the individual. So it's the rest of the Old Testament really talks about the nation of Israel, and when we get into some of the poetic stuff, it really talks about the individual. We think about Psalms, any individual psalm that you might read. It kind of starts with God, you're no good. God, you're no good. God, everything's going bad, and then but then God is faithful at the end, and He kind of has this kind of moment of that. So much of the rest of the Old Testament centers on the 12 tribes of the Hebrew race, and what they did. The poetic books are intensely personal. Someone has said this way: figuratively speaking, God's prophets spoke through megaphones, while God's poets often spoke in whispers. So we think about that. They're shouting it to everybody that can hear it. And a nation can do that, but the poets are speaking more silently, more to an individual. They're concerned with issues of the human heart, about loving God with not just your actions, but also with your emotions and how you feel about God, with your whole heart. They are concerned with the drama of life, common among us all. So whatever's going on in life, in your life, they kind of use that to teach you a lesson. Again, think of Job and his suffering, his boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet, and things like that. They are very experiential in nature. To call something poetic kind of makes it's kind of referring to a literary form. Yet again, many of the other writers who were not necessarily poets would use poetry kind of to convey messages. So there's an important kind of thing there. So let's look at the poetic books individually as we get into that. We look at Job. Job is possibly the oldest book in the Bible. Readers are given kind of a ringside seat to a cosmic battle that goes on between good and evil. The story begins with Job, a man of considerable influence, who loses everything: his children, his property, his physical health, his reputation, and even his wife and her support. She's there, but she's not real supportive of him in the midst of this, and kind of struggles with the question of why do good people sometimes suffer. Job is considered by many to be kind of the height of poetic literature in the Bible. So it kind of is important for this kind of discussion. And there's Psalms. The Psalms, again, were written by not just David, but the Psalms were kind of God's hymn book. Like when Jesus quotes the song, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" is Psalm 22 that Jesus quotes on the cross. And he would have known these things because these would have been prayers or songs that the people of God would have sung in worship when they gathered there. It's a collection of poetry penned by several different writers over about 1,000-year period. So King David was the one who wrote most of the Psalms. Moses is credited with Psalm 90. Solomon is said to have written Psalm 72 and 127. And many of the psalmists were written by other priests or Levites as they led the people in worship. So they weren't all written by these famous people. Sometimes we don't know who they, because it'll say, modern translations are normally say the psalmist. A lot of times you see a heading in your Bible if you're reading the Psalms, it'll say a Psalm of David or whatever else. But then sometimes it'll just say the psalmist says, and that's ones we don't know kind of who exactly to attribute that to, but it's probably some priest or some Levite who was leading the people in worship and wrote this song to kind of maybe sang this sermon, which you have to ask Rebecca. She can do that. She's the best singer of the bunch, of the three of us. So neither Ryan nor I are going to sing much of our sermon. So there are 150 psalms. And they cover topics like the magnificence of creation, the idea that how God's handiwork and looking around us and thinking about all that's going on. They cover how God alone is praiseworthy. They talk about the coming of the Messiah, of Israel's Messiah. There's a lot of psalms that are used to kind of predict some of that stuff, that one day God's going to come in the form of the Messiah and do that. They struggle with issues of the apparent prosperity of evil people, or why bad people have good things happen to them. Why don't they get punished all the time? They talk about sin and forgiveness, about what it means to live right, about when you need to repent because you've kind of lived wrong or done your attention has been focused elsewhere, and the idea of joy and how God is always faithful. And they usually the Psalms usually start in a much, like I said, a much more negative kind of way, and then kind of come around to kind of an understanding of where God is in the midst of all this stuff. So they're very interesting. Of course, the most famous one is Psalm 23. And we kind of know that. We read that all the time at funerals and other things like that. But every psalm, without exception, is really kind of a ability. If you read it with all the emotion, it can really kind of warm your heart a little bit. It's a good book to kind of read that way, to kind of know what's going on there. If you go through plans that read the Bible, like read the Bible in a year, or if you do the church on Sunday, if you go to a church that's a higher church that has a lectionary reading that reads from a prescribed set of lessons every Sunday, there will be different readings from different books, but there will always be a Psalter or a Psalm reading, because there's enough Psalms that you can read one all the time and never run out. This is really the only book where you can do that with. Everyone else, you can only read sections of it, but you can read a Psalm every Sunday for 3 years and be in good shape. So it kind of works well for that. Some of the topics that they cover, like I said, remember, it's personal kind of stuff too for some of the poetic language. So there's a personal struggle that goes on between where you are and where your faith might be. They talk about personal conduct, how you go about your day-to-day life. They talk about sexual relations. They talk about business, about wealth or money, about charity or giving help to others, about being ambitious or prideful, about what it means to kind of follow God's way, be disciplined, about what it means not to be in debt, what it means to raise children, your character, your alcohol, politics, revenge, godliness. All these kind of topics are covered in the Psalms. You can see it covers a wide variety of things as it deals with kind of the personal idea of there. So there are many subjects covered in those 150 Psalms as they kind of dive into all of those kind of things.
Aren't most of the responsive readings in the hymnal based on?
Yes, if you go to the back and read one of the responsive readings, which, by the way, this church is no good at. When we ever try to do a responsive reading in any way, it's just that this church has never, even for years before you all were, when you all were around, this church has never been very good at reading responsive readings.
Every other church I've been in, we did responsive.
Yeah.
readings.
Oh yeah. Me too. I've done them at times. I've done call to worships that have been call and response. I've done, we've had a song that's been that way or anything else, but for some reason, that has never been a strength of this church of worship.
All in the back of the hymnal, and I wonder if sometimes I just decided to leave that out.
No, there's some good stuff back there, and it's a good way of looking at the song. But we just have never
learning them too.
Yeah,
You do them every Sunday. You learn a lot of
You
songs.
do. It is good. It is good for that.
Yeah.
So,
Steve, I would be willing to say that within choirs who still do our spiritual music, it's not contemporary, there are lots of songs that we sing as anthems that are straight from the scriptures, and that's how I learned most of mine, was singing them growing up.
You just need some plants in the congregation to
Right.
just
Take a hold
out
of
strongly.
the renewed Baptist, the
So-
Methodist, and we'll do it.
Responsive readings.
Proverbs is God's wisdom book, and so it covers some of those same topics that we just talked about before. went too far. I went too far. Hold on. I'll get back. All right. And it covers some of those same topics we just talked about before. Ecclesiastes is the next kind of book. Ecclesiastes was, again, written by Solomon and explores what happened when he started to realize he lived his life kind of as in pursuit of worldly pleasures and other things like that. He kind of was known for, even though he was one of the wisest king ever lived, he was also known for kind of having many women, and that was kind of an indulgence that he kind of started to regret later in life as he kind of went away with that. So, and so Ecclesiastes kind of tells us, one of the ways that people talk about Ecclesiastes, it tells us what not to do with our life, what happens when you're in vain. Song of Solomon is the next. Again, we talked about that a little bit before. It's kind of an allegorical work that uses the relationship between Solomon and his young wife that he's smitten with in lots of ways as an image for God's love for humanity. And there's Lamentations as well. Again, is not always considered that, so I didn't do a lot with Lamentations, but it has some poetic elements to it as well. There are other poetic books. These are other books that we don't talk about as much. Wisdom and Sirach, both of those are included only in Catholic and Orthodox canons. They're not a part of our Bible. That's the apocryphal kind of stuff. Those books in that are poetic. And so these are the kind of the books of the Bible. The poetry of the Bible is beautiful. It's powerful. It's been written with imagination, and it needs to be read with imagination. So those are the poets kind of the Bible, and they kind of really kind of look at kind of the image to help us kind of get a picture of how we can use everyday life to kind of teach us lessons about stuff. I mean, we do that in our own lives when we try to teach a child a lesson or somebody else. We'll kind of tell a story, and we'll recount things, and we'll be a way in which we'll kind of use that to teach larger lessons. Any questions about the poets?
Do you think Solomon really wrote all of those himself, or were they just attributed to him?
I think pretty much we understand that he kind of wrote most of that stuff. I have a feeling, probably with most anything that was written that long ago, that there were other things that were interpreted and added in as scribes wrote them. Because remember, you're not talking about running it down to the copy machine and running off 150 copies and then handing it out. You're talking about somebody having to handwrite this on the next scroll or whatever else and pass it on to the other congregation that wanted to read it or whatever else. And I think sometimes there are always mistakes made. The other thing to think about when you think about that, especially with the Old Testament, is that Hebrew was written right to left, not left to right. And it would start at the top corner of the page. The way they would do it, because paper and scrolls were so expensive, they would start at the top corner of the page and they would just start writing. And there were no vowels in original Hebrew. In biblical Hebrew, there's no vowels. Now, when we study Hebrew in seminary now, there are what's called vowel markings, which means they put like little commas or periods or umlauts or different things in different places to kind of show you we think this is an A sound or E sound or whatever it might be. But that was not in the original language. And they didn't just stop when a sentence ended or a word ended. They just wrote. And so you could write at the end of a line, cover the top corner to the top corner of the page. And when you ended there, you would drop down and start writing the next letter at the back on the writing second line. It could be at the end of a sentence that happened. It could be at the end of a word that happened, or it could be in the middle of a word that happened. And so one of the things we scholars have always struggled with, and one of the things we always try to do is try to find the earliest versions of these and look at when you're studying this in seminary. One of the things you do is they have different translations, different versions of the Hebrew kind of stuff, so that they've studied to kind of where they think the breakdown was the most logical one. because we can't just figure that out on our own. It doesn't make it made sense to them, and they could do it. But Hebrew is an ancient language. Biblical Hebrew is. Like I said before, you can't. Even if I could remember all my biblical Hebrew, I cannot go over to Israel and have a conversation with somebody who speaks that language today, because it's a total different language. Greek in the New Testament is a total different language. Biblical Greek, Koine Greek as they call it, is a total different language than what they speak in the Greek Isles today. You just can't communicate the same way. So it's that part of it kind of at times will kind of make us understand that's happening, and we need to. And so they kind of try to do different scribes translations to kind of help make us the best understanding of how this works, and in context, of course, works out.
We have that trouble in English today.
Yes, yeah, we do. Yeah, we do.
Don't talk to a youth, because you're probably going to say the wrong thing.
Well, I always say that one of my there were things when I moved to Tennessee that I had to learn that I did not know before, and there were words that really kind of confused me. I've always said that I did not know what a meat and three was until I moved to Tennessee.
You didn't know,
I
you didn't know the word yes had 3 syllables in it.
And I never thought somebody would carry me somewhere where they wanted me to go. So I was kind of, all that stuff's kind of odd for me. So I had to figure all that stuff out. So
I grew up here, some of those I'd never heard.
Yeah.
It's like
anyway, yeah.
Karen.
So we've looked at poets, prophets, priests, kings in reverse order, kind of how we've done that. But we want to look kind of at an Old Testament overview to kind of wrap things up in the last little bit. There are 39 books in the Old Testament. There are 66 books in the Bible. There are 39 books in the Old Testament, and so that's where we are. Of the 39 books, all but about 5 concern Israel's status concerning Canaan, or the Promised Land. That means that, in other words, most of the Old Testament is really about land. And when we think about what books are there, we'll find out what that means. But and I don't. Please hear me say, I don't want to suggest that land is like the main theme but it's an image that's used to kind of help us understand kind of the story of God through the beginning of the people figuring out what it means to be a God. Land is a great way of wrapping your arms around the Old Testament. Here's what I mean. This is the chart I've given you, and you can look at kind of what's happened on this chart, and know that these kind of things happen: promise, preparation, entrance, settlement, loss, and return. Those kind of themes kind of help us understand that, and they're talked about that from the very beginning of the story to the historical books, through the story of the kings, to the story of the prophets. The priests, all kind of things get involved in that. And so I want to look a little bit at that chart, and you can kind of look at that chart as I kind of talk about it a little bit. So let's think about the promise, which is the very beginning of it. The promise starts with Genesis, and it's all about kind of the story of the beginning of who God is called as creating a people, and then leading them to the promised land. It happens in Exodus, of course. But Genesis is really a story about land. If you think about creation, God creates a land. Flood, God floods the land. And so land kind of becomes very, even in the beginning, becomes a very important part of the story of the Old Testament. God, in Genesis, halfway through Genesis, God starts making a deal with Abraham, a covenant with Abraham, that eventually he will possess a promised land. And even from the beginning, there's the exile of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, from land that had been God created for them because they had kind of done something that was against what God wanted them to do. So there's this idea at the beginning of land, and that really kind of is Genesis. It's the beginning of the Old Testament, kind of like there. So that's kind of before our kind of topic for this study, but anyway. And then there's this idea of preparation, and this is the idea that we're going from the end of Genesis on through Deuteronomy. So it's kind of what we call the Pentateuch. The first 5 books of the Old Testament are known as the Pentateuch, and it's really kind of there. It gets readers kind of ready for an entrance into the promised land. It's about a story of moving from one family, Abraham and Sarah and their son Isaac, to tribes, to the people that are there, to a nation that freed from slavery as we go through Exodus, to Moses meeting God on Mount Sinai in order to get the law, and then beginning to lead the people towards that promised land. So the first five books of the Old Testament are about the beginning of land and about the preparation to enter the land. So land becomes kind of a really big deal, and then you move into the entrance to the land. And that goes through Joshua and Judges and those books of the Old Testament, where they start to tell us about we finally made it here, and we in this land that God has promised us, and now we're going to go. And so they kind of had the stories around that, and the priests that helped lead the people in the beginning through the tabernacle getting established and moving that into the promised land, and of Aaron and his involvement there, and the leaders, the judges, and everything else that started to get established as they started to kind of understand what it meant to do that. As they moved to the next phase, which was the settlement. And this is settling in the land. And these are the beginning of the years that kind of lead up to the period of Judges that we talked about, into the united monarchy, which is where we have Saul and David and Solomon, who led this establishing the kings of this leadership. And in the midst of those kings, there were these prophets that spoke to them. Nathan was a prophet of David. There's Samuel, there's all these other prophets, but they're not the prophetic books that we looked at. They're these other prophets that worked in those things. So these kind of guys, and this is obviously the beginning of the establishment of the priesthood, as they begin to kind of establish some of the ideas of what it was like to live in the land that they were promised, and to settle into that land. The story of this kind of kingdom of God, this united monarchy, is about the realization of the promise that God made to Abraham to have a permanent home in Canaan, in the promised land, and how the journey they went on with Moses to kind of prepare themselves to enter the land and kind of get there. So it really kind of starts to do that. Then we get into most of what we talked about here, and this is the lost area, which is where just about the time they've settled into this area that's been promised them by God. They've had these kings that have led them. Then those kings die off, and as we talked about, the sons of these kings don't do a good job. They're kind of selfish. They lead the people astray. The priests don't do a good job. They don't lead the people in the ways of God they're supposed to, and the prophets have to come up and call them back to that. And so the nation gets divided, and they go into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And then the loss kind of gets a little bit more pronounced as we go through that. There's the exile of the northern kingdom in about 722 BCE to the Assyrians, and then of the southern kingdom to the Babylonians in 586 BCE. But it's really kind of the beginning of the undoing of the story that Old Testament told us from the beginning about how God started this thing, then God chose a people, then God expanded the people into a tribe, and then expanded the people into a nation, and then they kind of fell apart. And so there's prophets that come along, and they try to call people back to a right way of living in relation to God. And we talked about the priestly reforms that were there that kind of helped people kind of remind themselves of that. But at the end of this, kind of the children of Abraham no longer kind of possess the land. It's all been undone. And then there's also a second stage of this loss that happens. And that's really the kind of where the prophets are real prolific, where they really do a lot of their thing. Most of the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the 12 minor prophets, deal with this idea of exile, of living apart from the nation that God had promised them, and threats to a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, and then living in exile. And then other prophets will deal with the return to the land. Because what will happen next is that God will return them back to the land that He promised them. It's almost as if God is, the way they interpret the event is that God has made this promise to Abraham from the beginning, and that's the beginning of the kind of the Old Testament narrative. God leads them. God protects them by leading them. That what ultimately ends up through Joseph leads them into Egypt, then ultimately leads them into slavery, and then Moses frees them from slavery, takes them back, leads them into this promised land that finally they're going to have, and does this, and this story kind of falls apart as we do this and kind of look at this, these prophets kind of come out and try to, if you get yourself right with God, you think about Nehemiah who comes back and is a cupbearer to the king and gets the king's permission to come back and start rebuilding Jerusalem and kind of that. So it's an important part of the story about the land, about promise of the land, possessing the land, losing the land, and then returning to the land. So there's these books of the Bible that kind of lead with all this stuff, and of those books of the Bible, only about 5 of them are not directly related to this part of the story. They don't tell Israel's story of the land. Those books are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. So the poetic books that we talked about today, those books don't really deal with that same subject. But all of so you take those 39 books and you take those 5 out, there's 34 books that really deal with the issue of the land that God has promised to the people. So this story that we've told through these people really kind of leads us through understanding how they were figuring out what it meant to live as the people of God. Sometimes they did it well. A lot of times they did not do it well. And one of the things that's clear that we understand from reading it as a whole is that while they struggled at times to think that this was God punishing them because they'd done something wrong, it was more along the lines of them, they just had consequences because they went down the wrong path. They didn't go down the right path. There are consequences when we do that. It's not necessarily a cosmic punishment from God when we do things that we're not supposed to do. Sometimes it's just the consequence of your actions. If you do something stupid, sometimes stupid things happen to you. We know that. That's true of our lives. I think one of the things that's we got to be careful about is reading this Old Testament story as a story about how when the people are right with God, things are good. When the people are wrong with God, things are bad, and it's God choosing to punish them or not punish them. I think you're just dealing with the consequences of a life not lived in right relationship with the God who called you to be his people. So that really becomes the kind of the story of the Old Testament, and it's led through all these different characters, poets, prophets, priests, and kings that lead this through this whole kind of narrative to kind of begin to understand what it means to live as the people of God. And then ultimately they never really figure it out. I would maybe posit that even the nation of Israel is still trying to figure it out. As we think about what's going on today, and so I think it's just important to understand that that's not always the story, but it's a story that continues to go on for people of God, and if we're honest, it goes on in our lives as well.
So does that make it still about land in the Middle East?
Well, I think land is the image that they use in the Old Testament. I don't know that our story is about land because we don't tie into our narrative about land. But I think there are other things. I think
I'm talking about Israel and
a lot of the story of the current struggle
still
with Israel and their neighbors is the idea of land and who rightfully possesses the land.
Think about the Civil War here.
Yeah.
That was an issue that maybe still is.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some land issues about why that was there. I think still today.
We're very possessive people. I mean, human nature
Yes.
is possessive. We've been watching some of the Yellowstone stuff and it was about the Indian, the sheep herders and the cow people and I mean, it's man wants his domain.
Yeah.
And, I don't know that God really is that concerned with even the earth itself. I mean, God
Think
is more
about-
concerned about us.
Yeah.
How what's happening to us right now with thousands, acres and acres and acres of our land being filled with going up. And the thought of what it's doing to small towns like we were
Mhm.
is very upsetting to so many people that have grown up here and had lives here, and it's
Yeah,
changed.
there is
And it's to do with the
there's
land.
not as much open land surely around most places anymore as there used to be, but you know, again, I think it's interesting because that kind of even the struggle to kind of accept that is a struggle to kind of know that well, this is not what I think the land should be like, and you know, why do we have the right to be able to do that over somebody else, or why does somebody else have the right to be able to do that? And I think a lot of that has to do, for me, what I've noticed in Kentucky and even in rural places in Tennessee where I've been, that a generation dies off and the children inherit the farm, and they say, well, we don't want a farm,
Right.
but we can parcel this out to this builder and he'll pay us big money to be able to have this land to be able to build houses on. And so that's a great way for them to make money off the land rather than.
Tucker's Crossroads is the one holdout, I will tell you,
Yeah.
because they had people that were gonna come out off of the interstate. You already read about this. They had a big uprising, and there were 300 tractors that came from Tucker's Crossroads to the courthouse, and they won. They won.
Well,
That's the only
like
house
I
we
moved here from
agricultural. land.
Cross Plains in Robertson County, and Cross Plains has not permitted sewers to come through town, and the reason they keep the inconvenience of having no sewers is because you can't build as much if you don't have sewers, and because that way all the restaurants and the hotels and everything else that are off the exits, their other exits up down 65 can't come in there because they got to have attachments to sewers to be able to do that. And so and if you talk to the old guard in Cross Plains, they'll tell you, as long as I'm around, they'll never put sewers in this town because that'll keep the riffraff out. So that's, it's a
Building in concrete creates other problems with flooding, and they think, why are we having this flooding? Well,
But it's so frustrating when you think about like how the bypass wasn't built, and so 109 is the trucker lane.
Yeah.
You know, because somebody's land was going to be impacted. I mean, that
Right.
whole
yeah.
you can see good and you can see bad, but
Well,
we're growing
there-
so much.
our neighborhood, 4 years old, about 5 years old, there off Crowell Lane, and they built our neighborhood, and we're the first people to own our home and all that kind of stuff. Well, they're now building another neighborhood a little bit farther down, and Heather's on the Facebook group for our neighborhood. I'm not. I stay out of that
It's
because I
bad.
don't want to talk about that. But they were bombing kind of to break up the limestone and everything else. They were doing all this kind of stuff. Blasting, not bombing, yes.
Blasting,
Felt like bombing.
It felt like a bomb at times.
Yes,
But they and they're cutting a road back through the back of our neighborhood down to connect this neighborhood and everything else, and so they've torn out some trees and everything else, and the people in my neighborhood are going nuts because they just I can't believe that they're all this stuff and everything else, and I tell them all the time, I said, what do you think the people that have lived in these houses across Crowell from us for generations thought when they started building our neighborhood? But now we've lived here 4 years, and all of a sudden we got the right to be able to say you can't build over there. I mean, that's the same. I mean, it's if they had done that, you wouldn't have a house to live in. I mean, that's kind of the other part of it is that I have to realize that all the time. So it's
We're selfish people.
The first thing they do is take out all the trees.
Yeah.
Why can't they just leave the trees?
His house is
They
still
can't
there.
build close enough to each other, they're 5 feet apart.
well, because if you take out the trees, if you dig a foundation, you're going to tear in the roots, and the trees are going to go down anyway. So there's all kinds of things. But they, I mean, it is what it is. And there are a lot of benefits, like you said, there are a lot of benefits to the fact that our community is growing. There's a lot of things that you have here that you didn't have 10 years ago that are businesses and opportunities, and so that's an all right thing too. So there's positives and negatives that go with all of this stuff. So
It's
And there was for the stories of the Old Testament, kind of leading through this stuff. But so I guess what I would say is that this story as a whole is not that distant from us and our story. It's not like we read this thing and we can't do this thing. One of our retired bishops, Will Willimon, who was the dean of the chapel at Duke Divinity School when I was growing up early in ministry before he became bishop, but he was teaching in Louisville at one of the seminaries in Louisville. It wasn't the one I went to, but it was another one in Louisville, and he was teaching this group of a public presentation. And some lady said at the end of it, she said, "I really can't stand the Old Testament." He said, "Why not?" He goes, It's so violent. There's just violence everywhere." And he said, "I would think living in a city like Louisville, that would give you a lot in common." and I think there's a truth to that. I think living where we do at any point, there's a lot in common. These stories are not just wild stories that don't have anything to do with us anymore. They really do have a lot to teach us about what it means to be the people of God, and how that generation struggled with what that meant and did it well and did it not so well, and how we might struggle with what it means to be the people of God, to do that well and to do that not so well. And I think there's some important lessons in these people, and I think there are times when we might act like poets, prophets, priests, and kings in the way we do. We kind of try to figure that out. So that's why I like to look at these characters in the Old Testament. So anyway, so I hope it's been fun. I hope it's been educational for you as we think about the Old Testament. And there's a lot more that we can look at and talk about that as we go. But thank you all for participating in the study time.
Thank you.